Hello everyone and welcome back. This is Ariana Lopez and thank you for joining me again for our series on how to connect a proxy server to a public endpoint when using AWS IoT Greengrass. In this video, we will be creating an IAM role as well as creating our AWS IoT Greengrass device. So before we create our IAM role, what I'd like to do is create a S3 bucket that we will be using in our last video. But I'm going to need this S3 bucket because I want to give permissions to our IAM role. So I already have my bucket created, but what I'll do is I'll walk through the steps to show you how to do it. So you're going to be on the S3 page. If you're not on there, type S3 at the top in the search bar, and then under services, you'll see S3, and you can click that. But what we'll do is we will go to the button to the right of the page, create bucket, click that, and you're going to type in your name. For the bucket, for mine I used Greengrass V2 video artifacts. However, you're going to have to name yours something different. So maybe you want to name it with a dash name. So yours will be different from mine. Your region is US East, unless you put it someplace else. And then we're going to leave everything as is. So then you're going to create bucket. I've already done that, so I won't do that. So now that we have our bucket, we can go ahead and go and create our IAM role. Now for our IAM role, we'll type in IAM. So here we're going to go to roles, then click create role. Trust entity type AWS service, use case will be EC2. And again, leave as EC2. Scroll down and hit next. This role is going to be very similar to the proxy server that we created because we're also going to need to give it SSM access. So we will select Amazon SSM Managed Instance Core. But with this one, we're also going to need some more permissions, and this is mainly for what we're going to be doing in our last video when we do validation. And so we're going to need some read privileges. And for this, we're going to need Amazon S3. And we're going to do read-only access. We will also need Greengrass read-only access. And then we are also going to need some more access for Greengrass, but I created a policy for that. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to select that and open that in a new tab to show you. So here, this will allow you to describe get core device, create component version, create deployment. So yes, we have read-only access, but I also need the ability to create a few things here. All right, so what we'll do is we will select that as well. And if you remember a few minutes ago, we create our S3 bucket. Well, now I need to give my IAM role permission to access that bucket. So I created another policy, which I will show you. And I called it my component artifacts S3 permissions. And this is just going to give me get put objects, list all my buckets, get bucket location permission to that S3 bucket that I created. So I'm going to apply that to this role as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and name this, scroll down, and we will hit create role. So now that we have this done, the next thing we need to do is actually modify our S3 bucket. We want to apply a policy to it. So we'll go back there, select video artifacts. We will go to permissions. And here you can see a bucket policy. We'll select edit. And what you're going to want to do is apply a policy like this. So the first one we have is deny if it's not secure transport, so HTTPS, and you're not going to allow any access to that. The other thing here is we want put object permissions and get permissions, and you would specify the role that we created earlier. And so now we can go ahead and hit save. All right, so now we are ready to go ahead and create our Greengrass EC2 instance. To do that, we will go back to EC2 and scroll down a little. You'll see launch instance, click on the button. And here we're going to name it Greengrass V2 video. The image we'll use is Amazon Linux 2023. Instance type, I'm going to use a bigger instance, so T2 medium. Key pair, you don't need one, but I will go ahead and use one that I've already created. Network settings. Again, make sure for VPC we have the right one selected, which is Greengrass V2. Subnet, private, that's correct. We are not going to create our security group. We're going to select an existing one, which is the Greengrass one we just created. Advanced network configuration. No, we're good. Advanced details. We will want to select the IAM role we created. There we go. And we will go ahead and launch the instance. Okay, so now we just need to wait for it to spin up. All right, so our instance is ready, so we're going to select it. And then up at the top, you'll see the connect button. Click on that. And then here we have Session Manager selected. And this is why we had to enable the AWS Session Manager service, also known as SSM. This will allow us to connect to our device directly without having any SSH keys. So we will go ahead and click connect. And as you can see, we are now in this device. So this is our EC2 instance that will serve as our Greengrass device in this proof of concept. So the next thing we have to do is look at the AWS IoT Greengrass instructions. And what we're doing is we are installing AWS IoT Greengrass core software. But before we can do that, we have to follow installing with manual provisioning. And because we're setting this up to use a proxy, we want to do the manual resource provisioning. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow these instructions on the page. And you can see on the right-hand side, we have different points. And each one of those topics are instructions that we have to follow. Now, because the documentation can change, what I'm going to do is have you follow these instructions, and I will meet with you after you've done retrieve AWS IoT endpoints all the way to set up the device environment. Now, one key thing to note is when you are following the instructions from retrieve AWS IoT endpoints all the way down to download certificates to the device, you are actually running these commands on your local machine. So what you have to do is make sure you have the AWS CLI set up. So if you look at this tab, configure the AWS CLI, here you would have credentials that identify who's calling the API, and it gives you instructions on how to do that. And so what you want to do is set up AWS config on your local machine. So if I open up my terminal and I go to cd.aws ls-la, you'll see I have config and I have credentials. What you're going to want to do is have your credentials set up on your machine that will enable you to create or to follow the instructions in this manual. So if we go back here, you're going to be executing retrieve AWS IoT endpoints, create an AWS IoT thing, create the thing certificate, configure the thing certificate, create a token exchange role. All of these are going to be done on your local machine if you have the AWS config or the credentials on your local machine. Then you're going to have to download the certificates to the device. What I typically do is I will open up the certificates on my local machine and I'll just open them up VI, copy them, and then create them on, in this case, the EC2 instance. So again, the first 5 points will be done on your local machine, and then you're going to switch over to the EC2 instance in this proof of concept. So I'm going to leave you to it, but I'm going to come back and we're going to look at the setup of the device environment when we get to installing the AWS IoT Greengrass core software. You are going to have to create a config.yaml file, and this is where it's important that we set up the network proxy. And so I'll show you what my configuration file is to make sure you understand what needs to happen. So I will see you in a bit. Hey everyone, so you should be at the point where you are installing the AWS IoT Greengrass core software and at the point where we need to create a config file. So just so you know where I am in the docs, We are here in the Install AWS IoT Greengrass course software. So you should have completed all the steps above. And so now we are actually on the EC2 instance, and we are going to look at the configuration file and what it should look like. So I am on my EC2 instance now. I'm underneath my Greengrass installer. And what we're going to do is VI into the config.yaml. Now yours will be empty, but essentially this is what yours needs to look like. So the key thing here is make sure your thing name is correct to as whatever you called your device or your thing when you were creating it. You also need to make sure your region is correct. You also need to make sure your IoT role alias is correct. And then you're going to put in your credential endpoint as well as your IoT data endpoint. And then here we also want to add another attribute, Greengrass data plane endpoint, and specify that as IoT data. And what that means is the Greengrass data plane endpoint will use the value that is specified for IoT data endpoint. And then we have our MQTT port 443, as well as our Greengrass data plane port 443. Now here is our network proxy, and this is very important here. So here we're going to set up our no proxy address. A lot of these should look familiar. We created Route 53 entries for them. So they will be using the VPC endpoints. So here we have our proxy URL, and what we're using is the private IP address of our proxy server. So make sure you also include the port number as well. And so here we're going to exit out of that. And then the next step you would follow is running this command. And then you are done. Hey everyone, I'm back and I finished installing Greengrass on the device. And if you look here, I'm in my logs. I wanted to show you this. So it's basically saying that my Greengrass device has successfully connected to AWS IoT Core. Now, before we move on, there are a couple of things I want to install on the Greengrass device while we have internet connection. And one of them is the Greengrass Development Kit command line interface. And the reason I want to do that is we are going to use that later on to test. So we don't have this installed. Okay, so now we have that installed. So let's try this again. So I also need to install git, yum install git. All right, let's try it again. This is going to error out. I just want to check this. GDK component. So now that the gdk-cli is installed, we are going to leave this as is, and this will conclude this video. Please join me for our next video where we will use the gdk-cli to create a component and to test our connections.